Our academic keynote is from Lowery Woodall, who is our outgoing PWSA president, I think is the way to put that right now. And I would guess maybe the topic is a little bit important. So Lowry's going to be talking about a book that he just put out and connecting it to what is happening in the WWE and Vince McMahon. So that the title of his talk is What the Janel Grant Lawsuit Means for the WWE and the State of Professional Wrestling. Lowery is a department chair and associate professor in communication and theater at Millersville University in Millersville, Pennsylvania. And I'm going to let it go to you. So Larry's going to speak for a little while, and then we'll have another Q&A session, and then we will go into our professional keynote.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It's it's wonderful, first of all, to be here with everyone. I've been very fortunate to be a part of the organization for some time, and I'm always thrilled to see new faces, even if only virtually so. Be a part of what we do. I you'll forgive me for having not been able to be here earlier. I am recovering right now from heart surgery, and so my capacity for doing a lot of things is somewhat limited as a result of that. So yeah, the book that I had published was grappling with representation in the WWE, exploring issues of diversity and inclusion in world wrestling entertainment. And the book was really looking at how Vince McMahon had laid a groundwork for teaching his viewers certain lessons about morality and inclusivity that were in line with his own beliefs around those topics, and how he went about doing that with the different characters that he created and promoted in WWE. The talk I'm giving today, though, is not really about the book per se, but rather about Vince McMahon and the Janel Grant lawsuit. And if I have the ability here, I don't know if I have been given the ability yet to share my screen with you. One moment while I try to do so. Carrie Lynn, do I have
You should. Everyone has had so far.
Okay. Let me forgive me, folks, while I try to figure out. Oh, here we go. All right. So I'm going to just start the slideshow here on what the Janel Grant lawsuit means for the WWE, but also for the state of pro wrestling more generally. And so here's sort of a breakdown of what I'm going to be talking with you about today. We'll spend a little bit of time on going through the timeline of the lawsuit and the various pieces that have come out about it since really 2022 at this point. And then I want to spend some time talking about the WWE's response to that, how adequate and or inadequate that was. But then also really delving into what the implications of this lawsuit going forward are going to be for the company, what they're going to be for professional wrestling more generally, because certainly one of the major beliefs I have about this lawsuit is that it won't simply be affecting the WWE. This is something that's going to affect pro wrestling much more generally than that, which is really in keeping with my belief that much of what McMahon did over the last, say, 40 years impacted much more pro wrestling than just what was happening in his own company. And then finally, I want to kind of open up some discussion about what, if any, implications there might be from this lawsuit for the PWSA, in terms of what kinds of responses we might end up having to it as an organization, and I'm curious to know folks' thoughts on that as we talk. So I'm going to go through a bit of the timeline. Forgive me, I recognize that some of you may be more familiar with the lawsuit than others, but I just felt like we should all start kind of from the same place here. So on March 30th, 2022, the WWE Board of Directors received anonymous information that indicated that Vince McMahon had been paying essentially hush money to at least one woman who had worked for the WWE. In this case, we know that to be Janel Grant, who he had hired and had been having a sexual relationship with, and that he was then paying her hush money to cover up that relationship. And we may not have necessarily recognized at the time why he felt so strongly about that, but certainly after reading the affidavit in the lawsuit against him, I think it becomes much clearer now. On May 19th, same year, Stephanie McMahon announced that she would be stepping back from her role on the board and took what would be her first of 2 leave of absences. So right away, on one hand, we could say the WWE seemed like they were um, saying that they did not agree with what was happening here, that they were taking a stand against what McMahon had done and claiming that that was inappropriate. At the same time, though, we begin to see that there are some fluctuations there throughout the course of this. On June 15th, we get the first of 2 major Wall Street Journal articles that were published concerning the nature of the NDA payments to Grant, totaling $3 million. We now, of course, know that one of the reasons that Ms. Grant went forward with filing the lawsuit is because Vince McMahon failed to pay out the full amount of that NDA. I believe he only paid her $1 million of that $3 million. And so the NDA became voided. This also was the first time we were made aware that John Laurinaitis was implicated in these matters as well. On June 17th, Vince McMahon steps down for the first of 2 times from the board, and Stephanie takes his place as CEO. But again, here we begin to see that even though McMahon is stepping down and the company is in some ways taking action against him, he is still allowed to appear on SmackDown. He is also allowed to appear on 2 episodes of Raw within weeks of this. And so there's a sense that even though he is being ousted from the company is still holding him up as this sort of historically relevant, valuable figure that should be lionized in spite of this. Also, I will take a moment here to say, if you thought you were getting through this entire presentation without having to see Vince McMahon and his crazy 1930s movie villain stash that he grew, you were incorrect. Of course, I am going to draw attention to this. It's hardly the worst decision he's made in the past few years, but it's in the top 10. July 8th, 2022, we get the second Wall Street Journal article, which elaborated more on those NDA payments. We now know that there were $12 million to at least 4 different women, and that those payments date back to as early as 2005. So yes, Janel Grant is the focus of this particular lawsuit, but this is a pattern of behavior here, and that Janel Grant is simply one part of that larger pattern of behavior that McMahon had been involved in. And more importantly, and what I will argue a little bit later in this discussion, is that it's not just a pattern of behavior from McMahon, but also a pattern of behavior from within the culture of that company that he had fostered over many, many decades. July 22nd of the same year, McMahon officially retires from the WWE and resigns his seat permanently. Triple H is reinstated as the head of WWE Creative at that time. August 8th, John Laurinaitis is officially fired from the WWE as opposed to stepping down. November of that same year, 2 more women come forward with allegations against McMahon. One of those is an unnamed spa manager who claims that he assaulted her in 2007 at a luxury resort. The other is Rita Chatterton, a former WWE referee. In fact, I believe the first female referee in the history of the company, that says that McMahon raped her in 1986. For what it's worth, she also came forward with this allegation many years earlier, in I believe 1992 or 1993, but was unable to gain the momentum that she required to get any real restitution in that instance. Oh, here we go. All right. In December of 22, McMahon writes to the board arguing that he should be allowed to return in order to, quote, fully capitalize on the upcoming media rights renewal contracts and merger discussions that are going to be going on within the WWE. The board writes back to him, and I think their response to him is telling, that although we welcome your participation in the launch of a strategic alternative review process, it is also our unanimous view that your return to the company at this time, while government investigations into your conduct by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the SEC are still pending, would not be prudent for a shareholder perspective. This determination is based on a variety of factors, including non-public information the board has become aware of, and the risks to the company and its shareholders of placing a greater spotlight on these issues. So we're being told by the board at this point that they recognize that what McMahon has done is so horrendous that they cannot abide him returning. They also tell us that they know more than we have been made aware of at this point in December of 2022. And yet, in spite of that, by January of 23, McMahon uses his Class B super shares to remove 3 of the members of the board who had voted to keep him out. And he replaces those 3 members with himself and 2 like-minded members that he puts onto the board to help make sure that he has support as he returns. Even though McMahon does not hold the majority of regular shares of the board, he holds the majority of the super shares, 80%, I believe, at that time, which meant that for all voting purposes, if Vince McMahon did not vote in favor of something within the WWE, it was not going to happen. As a result of this, in January of that year, multiple board members, including Stephanie McMahon, resign in protest. And on April 3rd, Endeavor announces a new partnership with WWE that will merge them with the UFC under their holdings company, which they will now call TKO. They stipulate, though, that in order for this merger to take place, McMahon has to be the CEO of the company, of the WWE. So Ari Emanuel, who you see here in this photograph with Dana White and Triple H, was adamant that he respected McMahon's historic vision for wrestling enough that it for him, it overpowered whatever potential complications came with McMahon remaining in a position of power on the board. And so I think it's important to recognize that they made this corporate decision in spite of what we now know the board already knew at this point. They've already told us they knew more than we did. They already told us that they knew enough to, many of them, feel uncomfortable having him there. And yet one of the first actions that TKO takes, or that Endeavor takes in this partnership with WWE, is to say we must have Vince McMahon as part of this deal, or no deal takes place. In July of that year, federal law enforcement raids McMahon's home in connection to these allegations. In this, they take his cell phone, they take his computers, anything that he could have been using to contact and be in connection with Miss Grant and presumably a number of other women who might be involved in this. On July 21st, McMahon takes a medical leave of absence to have spinal surgery done. And on January 24th, Janel Grant officially files the lawsuit that we are now talking about, alleging sexual trafficking, amongst other allegations, sexual abuse, etc., by McMahon and Laurinaitis, stemming from her hiring in 2019 through 2022. Also importantly, Brock Lesnar is indirectly accused in this lawsuit, although he is not specifically named, the way the language is used within the lawsuit, it's almost impossible to imagine it being anyone other than Brock Lesnar. She accuses Lesnar of having used her as a sexual pawn during contract negotiations, essentially that McMahon had promised Grant to Brock Lesnar as part of his contract negotiations, that he would be allowed to have sexual relations with her as part of that. I think the fact that Lesnar has been removed from all WWE television, that he was not seen at the Royal Rumble, is fairly good evidence that Lesnar was in fact the person that was intended here, and that while he is not officially named in this lawsuit, he was deeply connected to these issues. So then we need to talk about the WWE's response and why it was accurate. And let me just take a moment, by the way, and say that one of the reasons I chose not to include some of the more specific language that we now have from the lawsuit for this in this presentation. You can read the full affidavit if you would like, but if you've not done so yet, some of the, particularly the text messages that are included in there from McMahon to Grant are so graphic and so specific that I didn't feel comfortable including them in the presentation. I really felt like that needs to be a decision that you make individually, whether or not you want to expose yourself to that. I just didn't feel comfortable including it here. But certainly I hope that that gives you a better sense, if you've not already had it, of kind of how we got to the place that we're at right now and who some of the major players in that really are. So was WWE's response adequate? Well, their response was multifold. They did fire McMahon again on January the 26th of 2024, following the official filing of this lawsuit by Grant. Ari Emanuel and some of the other top executives in TKO and Endeavor more or less forced him to resign. And he has, at least up until now, remained away from the company since then. They also, had fired Laurinaitis. He remains fired. He remains removed from the company. So the two main actors in the lawsuit have lost their jobs as a result of this. And yet, is that really enough? Because there are still several people within the company who are alleged to have had knowledge of these events that are still working for them, including Nick Khan, one of their co-CEOs. And there's certainly the possibility that Triple H knew about this. Ann Callis, who is Grant's lawyer, alludes to as much in some of the recent interviews that she has given to different wrestling podcasts, that while Triple H is never officially named in the lawsuit, she has been extraordinarily cagey about answering this question. She has certainly not been willing to come out and say, we have no evidence that Triple H knew about this, or that he is completely exonerated from having knowledge of this. At the end of the day, he was a top official in the company. He was involved in high-level board meetings. It seems reasonable to suspect that whatever the other top executives in this company would have been aware of, that he would have been aware of it to some degree as well. And so I would say that, at least for me, it's a bit too soon to tell whether or not their response will be adequate. What I will say is that I would agree that McMahon's departure alone will not be enough. I think I was very underwhelmed, quite frankly, personally, with Endeavor's initial response to this. I think they've begun to recognize that this is not the sort of thing that is going to be swept under the rug or is going to go away anytime soon. And I would point to a quote from Ann Callis here, which I very much agree with in terms of her sort of framing of the WWE's response, wherein she says that McMahon's removal from the company is a positive first step, but the circus-like atmosphere that contributed to this culture of corruption and victimization has to be addressed. And I certainly agree that there is a larger culture within the WWE that needs to be looked at more fully here. And so that brings us then to the implications for the WWE. Um, uh, we have to recognize that this is far from being over for them. First of all, there are almost certain to be new allegations that will be added to this. Certainly, Ms. Callis has made it clear that there have been many people who have reached out to her who have said that they want to be involved in this lawsuit in one way or another to tell their story. It's unclear right now whether this will become a class action suit or whether this will remain something that is specific to Grant, or if there will simply be more lawsuits following her as well. But I think it would be um, poor judgment to assume that once Miss Grant's specific lawsuit is settled, that will end this sort of larger investigation into the culture of the WWE. I would point specifically to someone we've already seen be brought back up as a result of this, and that is Ashley Massaro. Ashley Massaro was a WWE wrestler back in the early 2000s. She had talked previously in sealed documents about some of the situations that had occurred to her during her time in the WWE. The most serious of those was she alleged that she was raped while on tour with the WWE for their tour with the troops in Saudi Arabia. And that while she was in Kuwait in 2006, someone representing themselves as being a doctor for the U.S. Army raped her. That she told WWE officials about this, that McMahon and other officials knew about it, and that despite them knowing about it, their reaction was to essentially sweep it under the rug and not take it seriously. Uh, for his part, Edward Brennan, who is John Laurinaitis' attorney in all of this, said of the Ashley Massaro situation that most upper-level management were aware of the allegations, which included McMahon and Laurinaitis. Massaro also claimed in these newly released statements that McMahon commonly made out with other divas in the locker room, which would have been the common parlance at the time for female wrestlers in the company, but that she would often find herself in the locker room seeing him engaging in sexualized behavior with other female wrestlers. And that he aggressively tried to coerce her into his hotel room after she appeared on the cover of Playboy in 2007. Before that, apparently, according to her, he was not interested in her prior to that. But after she made an appearance on the cover of Playboy, he suddenly became very actively and aggressively interested in her sexually. And that when she rebuffed his advances, that he responded by burying her career because he refused to have sex with her. She was fired in 2008. She sadly committed suicide in 2019. I am not necessarily suggesting here that her suicide is directly connected to what happened in the WWE, but I do think that the tragedy of the end of her life has to be included as part of this story because I just feel like you can't talk about how she was ignored in this awful thing that is alleged to have happened to her without also talking about this tragedy of the end of her life. Also, for the WWE, other wrestlers may end up refusing to sign with the company due to a misalignment of values or perceived values with the company. Or certainly, I mean, I would imagine there are many women who are going to, rightly so, be concerned for their safety in a company that would allow these sorts of things to happen. AEW offers a WCW-like alternative in the sense that you could go somewhere else and make similar compensation as you would to the WWE. There's no reason that you have to work for them to make the most money that you possibly can in this business. So as long as a company like AEW, something of their stature is there, I think that it's reasonable that some wrestlers will decide they would rather work somewhere that they feel safer than they might in the WWE and the culture that it has right now. I think they also have an issue of how they're going to handle McMahon historically. So the photo you see here is from the latest WWE video game, the 2K24 video game. And in many of the cinematic cutscenes, if McMahon was previously included in them, as you can see here, they've already blurred his face out. But this is going to be a more complicated situation than, say, a Chris Benoit problem, where you can sort of cut around Chris Benoit. You can leave some of his work in the archives without drawing attention to it. McMahon, trying to get around McMahon historically with the company isn't just about cutting out the pieces of footage that he is involved with, although that in and of itself would be extraordinarily difficult. As the book that I wrote talks about, Vince McMahon for the last 35 or 40 years is the WWE. Every character that was created, every major choice that was made is a choice that he has his fingerprints on. And so it's difficult to imagine how they can fully celebrate and embrace the years of his ownership of the company while also trying to avoid talking about him. It's going to be a tremendously difficult tap dance that they're going to have to do, especially as more and more about these allegations comes out. In terms of implications for pro wrestling more generally, what I want to say here is that this isn't simply limited to McMahon or Laurinaitis or even to the WWE. It's more indicative of a culture of coercion and harassing behavior that we've seen normalized in pro wrestling for many years now. I think about people like Teddy Long and Ron Simmons in WCW. Obviously, not necessarily sexually harassed here, but the racism that they face. Teddy Long has talked, for example, extensively about the racist remarks that people like Ric Flair presented him with. Ron Simmons, for his part, told people like Mark Henry, whatever you do, don't go to WCW. They don't know how to treat you down there. They're going to treat you in racist ways if you do go there. And then we think of people like Fabulous Moolah and Billy Wolf and the history of sexism and exploitation that there is for women in pro wrestling. Moolah, if you've seen her Dark Side of the Ring episode, for example, that's a fairly compelling argument against Moolah and the kind of person she was and what she allowed to happen to the women that were under her wing. And Billy Wolf is sort of the prototype of mistreating women in pro wrestling. He was an early women's wrestling promoter. And in the chapter that I have in my book where I talk about gender issues in the WWE and in pro wrestling more generally, I end that chapter by saying that one of the kindest things I can say about women's pro wrestling today is that Billy Wolf would not recognize the women's pro wrestling that exists today. And surely that's the best thing that can be said about where we are and how far we've come. And yet, this sort of behavior is indicative of the kind of culture that could lead to the sort of treatment that we are seeing in these lawsuits, and the way that was normalized, the way it was swept under the rug, the way that people felt uncomfortable or unwilling or unable to speak up when they saw it. And I also want to point out that, as we talk about this being something that happens outside of WWE as well, this is also a problem that AEW is facing to a certain degree, maybe to a lesser degree than what we're talking about here, but it shows you that this can happen there as well. The Chris Jericho, Kylie Ray situation that came up earlier this year is, I think, a very profound example of this, where Jericho is alleged to have lured Kylie Ray to his hotel room under false pretenses, saying that he wanted to talk to her about the quality of her matches or kind of where her character was going to be going in the coming months. He made it seem like they were going to be a litany of people from AEW in the hotel room with him when she got there. Instead, it was just Kylie and Chris Jericho there. without anyone else in the room. She felt uncomfortable. She left. But she has, while she hasn't said explicitly, everything that happened, she has made it clear publicly through Twitter, X now, that there is some veracity to these claims. And I say that only to say that I don't want us to get into the misperception that this is only a WWE problem or only a Vince McMahon problem. There's also, I would say, a need for unionization of wrestlers here. I've thought that for many years, but this is, I think, is another example of that. And I would hope that maybe one of the things that comes out of this is that wrestlers begin to feel, particularly female wrestlers, begin to feel more courage or conviction to try to put together a union for themselves here, because it feels like unless wrestlers are looking out for each other, there's no company that is going to do that for them. And then, I wanted to end this by kind of posing a question of what, if any, response there should be from the PWSA to this. Do we have some sort of responsibility as an organization to respond to this kind of behavior within the pro wrestling industry? Obviously, we aren't only representing the WWE. We don't only talk about them. We don't only talk about AEW. But yet, when this kind of behavior really takes the spotlight, do we have some responsibility to respond to it in a public manner? Not necessarily to McMahon only, but to this larger culture of abuse and neglect that appears to have really been a problem within the pro wrestling industry for a number of years now. And we're perhaps seeing just how bad it is on a level that we have not previously, and being exposed to it on a granular level that we have not previously. And so, one of the things that I thought might be interesting to discuss here are what kind of responses, if any, that might look like for us, whether that would be a formal statement that would be on our website somewhere, whether there might be a special issue of the journal that looked at issues related to sexual abuse within professional wrestling, and how that should be handled, or whether it might be something like donating to organizations that support the victims of this kind of abuse and behavior. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that I know for sure that it's our responsibility to do this, but I think it's an interesting conversation to open the door to. And certainly it's the sort of thing that I imagine over the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see a lot more written about within the pages of professional wrestling journals, within the pages of anthologies about pro wrestling that come out. And so it seems to me that the organization that we're also proud to be a part of should probably have some sort of a formal stance on this, beyond the obvious of we obviously detest this kind of behavior, but we are leaders in this area, and it seems to me like perhaps we have a responsibility to speak about that in a more formal manner for all the other media that may be looking into this in the coming months and years. So that's where I will end things, and I'll open up to kind of larger conversation from there. I will stop screen sharing now. And yeah, I mean, I would just open it up to anyone's thoughts and ideas about this, and be happy to talk to you about it in any way you'd like.
Great. Thank you, Lowery. And actually, one thought I just had is maybe if people are interested when it comes to membership, if we could have a directory of content, public facing contact information as well as expertise, so that if the organization does receive any requests from someone in the news media to talk about this, we would be able to direct them to you given your expertise. That's just something I was thinking about. But does anyone have any questions, comments, suggestions to join the conversation here with Lowery and the rather sad nature of this topic, I suppose?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to bring the whole room down with this.
No, no, it's a necessary conversation. And if we're not being, honest and reflective as to all of the things that are happening in professional wrestling, then we're not doing our jobs as scholars. Would be my statement on that one. And any thoughts? Because I know Hannah, you mentioned in chat about your wrestling friend and his thoughts on unionization. I don't know if you want to speak to that, or if anyone else would like to speak to what Lowery was talking about.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So Carrie Lynn knows one of my good friends is Cheeseburger. If you guys know Cheeseburger from like ROH, yeah, so he's a really good friend of mine, and I talk to him about unionizing all the time. Because I was my father worked for UAW for his entire life. I was raised a union baby, and I hear I read like the affidavit from Grant, and I hear all these stories, and I hear things from Cheeseburger and things like that, and all the time I'm like, why don't you unionize? Like, why doesn't wrestling have a union? Right? Like with recently, like AEW made several cuts, like the boys, and I'm blanking right now because it's been a long day. Dasha, right? Like all these cuts, kind of seemingly out of nowhere and at a really bad time. Like, what was their like PR doing? Why did they think that was a good time to announce that? But right, and I was like, if you had a union, this couldn't happen. But the one thing he always says is that, well, I mean, he's talked about there have been multiple efforts to unionize within wrestling, and they have always failed. And he brings up like, because wrestling, there's so many egos in wrestling, and because you have to go into business for yourself to kind of make it. He talks about how like people don't want to and like are unwilling to think about the collective to like get that process going. And he brings up like within like WWE and AEW, he's like, like you're not going to get somebody like Roman Reigns on board. And I'm like, well, like, yeah, maybe, but like why not start smaller? But then like the indie scene is so fractured, then how do you get that going? But and like talking about unionizing is something that like comes up in the wrestling community from time to time, and there have been a few efforts, but it always fails. And Cheeseburger's always like, yeah, I mean, having a union would be great, but the task of organizing a wrestling union has certain challenges that organizing in other spaces don't. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I know probably the most famous example of this, right, was Jesse Ventura trying to unionize WWE wrestlers in the 1980s, and you can thank Hulk Hogan for that not happening. But I know that it's a difficult thing to do. It is certainly fraught with many potential problems. But it seems to me that when we see this kind of rampant behavior across multiple federations, and there are bound to be other stories about this in other companies that we've just never heard of. They just never been made public. Um, my faith in companies like Endeavor and in billionaires like Tony Khan and Vince McMahon to protect wrestlers is thin, we shall say. I think that their main concern is always going to be the bottom line, and it's always going to be shareholders, and it's always going to be doing what's best for them and the company, and not necessarily always in doing what's best for the individuals that work for them. So, yeah, that's just where I stand on it.
Brad, go ahead.
Sure. Hey, everybody. Hey, Lowery. Thank you for your talk. Yeah, I think that I'll address this a little bit in my keynote as well. But when it comes to unionization, I think that the best opportunity would be for them to join something like SAG. Because I don't think, like, sometimes people compare, wrestling exists in this sort of no person's land between theater and sport and whatever else. And it's not really as good of a comparison to talk about sports teams or sports leagues, because they're on teams, right? And so there's a little more solidarity built into the organization when you're on a team together. But wrestlers are individual workers, the same way that actors and writers are in SAG, and I think that being entertainment and not sport, that would be their best shot. But again, to Hannah's point, it's like, how do you get the activation energy to have the reaction take place, to have people stick their necks out enough to do it, right? And even before you get to unionization, couldn't you get to employee status and, versus independent contractor? And that's a whole nother issue, but it's a great topic.
I don't know if anyone had feelings on what sort of reaction, if any, officially there should be from us as an organization to this. Again, I'm somewhat on the fence about what the best reaction from us looks like. But I will tell you, I cannot help but feel a certain amount of deja vu in this, because before I was involved with PWSA, one of the organizations I was involved with was the Whedon Studies Association, which looked at Joss Whedon and all of his various properties. And I also gave a keynote for them once after Kai Cole, his now ex-wife, made it clear exactly what kind of a person Joss Whedon was. And then we had a conversation about what should the response from that organization be. And I think they had a harder time swallowing that pill than maybe our organization would have, in part because we're not tied to a single individual. This isn't the Vince McMahon, studies club or anything like that. But nevertheless, I can't help but feel as if there's a bit of a black cloud hanging over me, that every professional organization around pop culture that I join, inevitably, eventually, one of the people that's heavily involved in it turns out to be a scumbag. I'm hopeful that there's, that this one turns out differently than it did in the case of Joss Whedon. But yeah, it just feels like we need to say something about it.
I also think you might have your next topic of your book soon. The billionaires and the creators who've been canceled. Hannah?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We as a organization need to, I think, take a very firm stand. And you mentioned, something beyond, putting out a statement like, we condemn the actions of, right? Like, that is mostly an empty statement that isn't actually doing any good, or that's not necessarily taking any concrete steps. So I'm really interested in people's thoughts on, okay, if we agree, yeah, we need to take a stance on this, publicly, what would that look like? To me, one thing that comes up is, internally, at least, I think, an affirmation that we are not going to sweep these things under the rug, right? That we, as an organization, even just within ourselves, will acknowledge these things and make space to talk about these things. And make space for different types of conversation about these things, not just necessarily academic or professional, but a space that's a safe space to talk about these things.
Yeah, Jory just put in chat, we're deriving enjoyment and extracting value from wrestlers' labor, so we may not be strictly responsible for the conditions they're worked under, but we can be accountable. And it seems to reflect also, discussions in fan studies, like research into fans, when fans engage in this type of how do they handle problematic content creators like Whedon, for example, but a lot of other people as well. So maybe there's something we could learn from fans too. But I do think there's also that interesting question about how are fans responding to this? Because I put in the chat, I'm wondering if a lot of the CM Punk support that we've seen, especially this week, has been a way to try to change the narrative, and it seems to be woven into the tribalism as well. And I don't know if Laura, if you have any sense as to how fans have been responding to these allegations.
I would say I've actually spent less time looking at how fans have responded to it than I have at how wrestlers have responded to it. There have been several wrestlers within the company that have been openly asked about this, especially over WrestleMania weekend. They were kind of scrutinized about it, and I think it's interesting. Some of them have had sort of the boilerplate non-response that you might imagine, the sort of, well, it's obviously awful to hear this, but it wasn't my experience of him, and I didn't see this happen myself, so I don't really have much that I can offer. I thought actually that of all the wrestlers that I heard speak, that CM Punk had one of the most sort of concrete responses to it, where he was being interviewed on a podcast or a radio show during WrestleMania weekend, and he was much more impactful about saying, look, if these allegations turn out to be true, if they are proven to be true in a court of law, then number one, Vince McMahon is a horrific human being, and should be held accountable. But I actually thought the more important thing that he said, and something that it's bothered me that I haven't heard more wrestlers including this portion of it, right? He said, it doesn't really matter what I think at the end of the day. What matters is that if these women have been victimized in this way, that they are receiving the help and the support that they need. And that should really be where our focus is on how do we support them? How do we make sure that they have the systems around them that they need to recover from that trauma, to live their lives, and to also make sure that things like this don't happen to other people, that we end this sort of pattern of victimization that has clearly been allowed to exist within pro wrestling. And choking out Jack Perry notwithstanding, I thought it was a particularly poignant response in comparison to what people like Seth Rollins, for example, have said that I've heard, which making sure to center the victims in this, and not just the wrestlers, and what their thoughts on it were, what it's like to keep working for this company in spite of what has happened. I thought that was a particularly good response on the part of Punk.
Great. All right. So maybe what we can do is start a discussion on Discord about this, and maybe even start drafting some language. That would be good to have here. So thank you, Lowery, for this talk. It might be, not great in terms of the topic, but it's great in the terms of this is something we need to be addressing. And I think that's good for us as an organization. So thank you so much.